Morning all, let's check out the round 5 games. So at the start of this round, Magnus Carlsen and Neville Aronian were leading the tournament. And okay, Ivanchuk playing white against Magnus Carlsen. Ivanchuk was currently a back marker along with Gelfand in this tournament, so could he put up a good fight against Magnus? So he played actually d4, and Magnus played knight f6, and we saw a Grunfeld defence after knight c3 d5 in the spirit of the hypermodernists. So black aims to destroy white's centre, encouraging it to be constructed and destroy it later. Now this next move, bishop f4, looks like a solid approach instead of playing c takes d5, which is I think the most common move. So bishop f4, bishop g7, knight f3, Magnus castled, e3, so it's a very solid position for white. If the bishop had gone to g5, there's ideas like knight e4 which can be annoying. So the bishop on f4 is exerting queenside pressure. c5 now. D takes c5, queen a5. This looks all pretty much theoretical at the moment. Rook c1, rook d8. Now queen a4. White doesn't mind the exchange of queens here for sure. He'll be keeping control of c5 pawn as well, keeping protection. So Magnus avoids exchange of queens, plays queen takes c5. But now white plays b4, attacking the queen. Queen c6. Now queen a3, and this is quite an annoying diagonal potentially on that e7 with b5 as a potential threat coming soon. Magnus takes on c4, and actually b5 is played here. Queen b6, bishop takes c4. White seems to have a very pleasant position at the moment with pressure on e7. Magnus plays bishop e6. This bishop's taken. Queen takes e6. And now white castles before undertaking any active operation, which is a good idea usually. But there is a lurking threat now of knight g5 just to get the queen away from e7. Okay. And Magnus actually doesn't try and do anything about that. He doesn't want to, say, weaken his king side a little bit with h6. There's probably other threats to consider, which we'll try and check maybe in a second pass here. It seems quite an uncomfortable position, actually. So Magnus actually played knight bd7, and with this he's basically sacrificing a pawn after knight g5. He's offering the e7 pawn. Another alternative, which I think engines were recommending actually, instead of knight bd7, was actually bishop f8 as well. But anyway, so queen f5, offering a pawn. What is Magnus getting for the pawn? Well, this knight is slightly loose. It's only protected by the bishop. So Magnus plays this aggressive knight h5 now. So he's on f4. It's a slightly vulnerable knight. But there's a counter-attack on d7 with rook fd1. Magnus takes on f4. After takes, now kicks the queen with bishop f8. Queen e4. And white is pawn up, but these are doubled pawns. So the extra pawn on this side of the board might be compensated by black's potential pressure on the queen side as well. These might be liabilities, or they might be dangerous pawns later. So Magnus takes, and knight b6. He's also got to be concerned about these checks, like f6 looks vulnerable. But for the moment, there doesn't seem to be much point of knight f6 check. These knights don't want to be taking the h7 pawn and being really loose. So g3 is played, and now Magnus takes on d1, and now bishop e7 covering the f6 square anyway. Okay, it's a position where white would like to infiltrate, but he can't. This knight's holding up that d7 square. And also, if white plays like rook c1, there's rook d8, so black's going to get this quite dangerous rook eyeing down the c-file. But this b7 pawn might be a target to knight d6 here. So it's tricky position. Knight f3 is played. At this stage, actually, Ivanchuk's getting into time trouble. He's only got like minutes left, so he's got quite a lot of moves to get to move 40. And people on Chess Bomb, which is a live relay site, we're getting quite concerned. Is he going to sort of get into severe time pressure? He plays knight e5, rook c7 is played. So that seems to parry knight d7 in particular, to stop that. Try and get access to that 7th rank of blacks. But actually, I think in this position, we'll check this in the second pass, but briefly, I think there's a possibility that black might have, from an engine point of view, had f5 to get access to the c5 square, so knight g5, rook c5. But we'll check that out in the second pass. It's an interesting possibility there. But rook c7 instead was played. King g2. Now we see f6, kicking the knight back. It goes back. King f7. h4. Rook c2, which looks quite dangerous now. Black seems to have quite active piece play. a4. Now if this is taking it, it's just to lure the knight away from d7. That rook d7 will be quite nasty. So rook a2, just stopping the pawn in its tracks, as well as not taking it. Knight c3, kicking the rook to a3. Rook c1. Now obviously this pawn can be taken now, and it is. Knight takes a4. So back to being equal on material. Knight e4. But white has a pleasant prospect of a rook on the 7th. Rook d3 to at least stop knight d6 as a resource once the rook goes to c7 here. King e6, and I think this is slightly loose. It's only protected by the king, and I think engines were crying out here for g4. We'll check that out in the second pass. g4 with the idea potentially of f5. Slightly tactically vulnerable for black here with that rook on the 7th. Rook takes b7, rook d7, okay, rook d8, rook b8, rook d8, pardon me, rook b7, rook d7, and now actually Wesley takes the rooks, knight d4, okay, so in this position white is still doing well. An extra pawn he's just nabbed, so he's a pawn up again. But is this pawn slightly vulnerable? The king's more active at the moment than this king. We see f5, knight g5. That is taken. I think it's too dangerous to play something like h5, but we'll check that out in the second pass actually. Bishop takes g5, f takes g5, which gives potentially the king access to f4. And also here, we see now after knight c3, white can play actually h5 with a big threat of potentially knight takes f5, and if takes g6, and just getting this dangerous passed pawn going. So this is quite dangerous. Magnus, I think, needs to take on h5 here, because also there's another threat simply of h6 and knight takes f5 with the same idea. So Magnus takes on h5, and this fractures the pawns, of course, but white's pawns over here is remaining weak, which can potentially leave black in the balance here. King d6, king h4, king d5, knight takes f5, knight takes b5, king takes h5, king e4, knight e3, knight d6, king h6, check, and we get simplification now after taking knight h3. White's losing all the pawns, and if he's only got a knight, it's going to be a draw. White's lost all his pawns, can't make black, and it's drawn basically. Okay, so Ivanchuk shows that he's still dangerous. He's not going to lose every game on time. He successfully played lots and lots of moves quickly in this game with only minutes on his clock, and had a promising position for a large part of this game. Let's engine check some key moments here. Okay, so out of the opening, White enjoyed a slight plus. Now this move, even Queen A4 is mentioned at this point, but Rook C1, from an engine point of view anyway, now Queen A4 is one of the better moves in this position. Okay, Black played what looks to be, from an engine point of view, slightly inferior to taking the Queen actually, is Queen takes C5. Did it actually run into serious trouble? Queen takes C5. It seems we've got a slight plus for White after B4. Queen C6. Actually, Queen B6 is actually pretty nasty according to this. Queen B6 is well, we can. Okay, we've got C5 here, and now this is really, really dangerous for Bishop B5. So Black's got to be careful in this position about the Queen being kicked around too much. For those theoretically interested in what happened here, if we take here, for example, Rook H2, and the Queen is like, oh dear, what's happening to the Queen? The Queen's getting lost. Okay, so Magnus has got to be careful with his Queen in this position. So he plays Queen C6, which looks virtually forced. Queen A3. This all looks like strong moves from an engine point of view actually so far. Now B5. Okay, we see in this position Queen B6, Bishop takes C4. So White enjoys a slight plus here. Bishop E6. That's taken. White castles now. Seems Knight G5 might have been possible even here, but then Queen C4 is annoying. Why not castle first? In principle. So castling, keeping the threat of Knight G5. So it's interesting, if H6 to parry Knight G5, we can kick the Queen like this, Knight D4 perhaps, or there might be something stronger. Let's see this position. What's going on here? Depth 14. Anything really good for White? It's a loose thing move though. Maybe Max just doesn't want to play that in principle. Also, Bishop F8. I think actually Bishop C7 is annoying. Okay, but Bishop F8 might be also viable as well as H6. I think they're two viable moves. But Magnus's approach, yeah, is very interesting. This dynamic pawn sacrifice. So Knight BD7. I don't think it's mentioned. Oh, yes, it is mentioned a little bit here. So Knight BD7, offering that pawn for Knight G5, which it's accepted. This gambit is accepted. Gambiting that pawn. So Knight H5 now, and White is going to end up with some structural damage here. Rook FD1. Magnus takes on F4. Takes. Okay. So we see Bishop F8 here. Is there any other alternative? I think this is one of the better ones. Or H6 possibly, but Bishop F8 is one of the better ones. After Queen E4, not minding the exchange of queens. White's got the double pawns. It's not really a fantastic extra pawn up. White is now threatening actually. Rook takes D7 and Knight F6 check, it would seem. So that has to be parried. Yes, that has to be parried in Knight B6. And okay, so we see G3 here. Magnus takes, and he's got to be careful, I think. Or is actually Rook C8? It does seem as though that might have been technically possible, as well as Bishop E7. So maybe there's no absolute emergency to cover the F6 square. Just out of interest about losing the h7 pawn, is that of any significance here? Well, the knights are just getting, I think that would be ridiculous. The knights are just getting tangled and lost, so that's ridiculous. So this knight f6 is not a major problem in itself. Bishop e7 though is threatening potentially things like f5. Okay, so the knight goes back. What is black's main threat? King g7 h6. Okay, so the knight goes back. Rook c8. It seems very nice, this c file and the use of c2. Knight e5. Okay, and here, yeah, there was a suggestion from the engines to play f5 here instead of Magnus played actually rook c7, but f5. Let's have a quick look. Knight g5, rook c5. Let's go with h4, say rook takes b5. This sort of position looks as though it's pretty much going to be drawish. Okay, so we see rook c7 guarding that d7 square. So white enjoys a slight plus, but there's an episode coming up here which maybe shows, you know, Magnus is not, if he was playing Houdini, he might lose some of these games, because there was a slight risk taken, I think, with the king coming out later. We're about to see. After knight takes a4, knight e4. Okay, there's a big threat, it seems, with rook c7 and knight d6 here. So rook d3, interesting move. If he tried to stop the rook coming to c7 with bishop d8 out of interest, this might be okay, but what about the check and taking on b7? Might ask bishop b6. We've got something on f. We've got some pressure on f2 here, and this is a bit tricky. Black's now threatening, so rook a2 on f2. If we have this position, it's a dynamic approach. It's a different approach to the position from black, and it might actually be okay. This approach, bishop seems to be quite handy on b6 here, potentially. But okay, Magnus played rook d3, he's inviting that rook c7, and king e6. Now here, this is the point, slightly risky maybe technique, because of g4. This was cried out by people. Looked at this on the chess bomb site. G4 is actually threatening. This is really interesting. It's threatening f5. Very, very serious threat here. And yeah, if black plays f5, just have a look at this, just quickly. Takes, check, check. Actually taking here. We've got a dangerous pass pawn here, and this is really, really nice. So I don't know if g4 was a major opportunity missed, or is this actually, it seems knight b6. What is this doing in relation to f5? Let's have a quick look here. If king takes f5, rook takes e7 protects the e4 knight, so king f7 takes, our rook d7 is supported. So this might not be too bad for black. It's interesting. The king is kind of stuck though here. This pawn might be quite useful here, but still, this sort of evaluation is not convincing as a win in this sort of simplified position for sure. So okay, so maybe it's not a big deal at all. Magnus had considered g4. It doesn't necessarily win at all. So we see rook takes b7 instead, which also seemed promising for a moment. Okay, now we have some repetition, and then it's taken. So white just all the time had this modest advantage in this game. Okay, here, if the bishop doesn't take, then I think this might actually be trouble for Magnus if he didn't take. Or is it? Bishop c5, knight c6. We can kick that one and go to h5. Again, it's just nothing. Maybe it's just nothing here. Okay, so alright, Magnus just takes more radical, just taking, simplifying. I think this is better than hg. There's no opportunities for h5 basically of hg as well. It's not just the f4 square. There's the breaks are far less. The king will be closer to any g4 break to hold any pawn. So this is the more dangerous way of taking, for both knight f5 and h5 to be potentially serious threats. So after knight c3, h5. Okay. That's interesting that actually king c7 might even be possible here. I would have thought knight takes f5 is dangerous, or is it just ignored? It's just ignored. Knight takes, and again it's no big deal. That seems tricky. Okay, so knight e7, a5. Black can get his pawn going, and this might fizzle into a draw as well. Okay, so perhaps it's not so bad even for king c7 here, but okay, g takes is played, and white is going to lose all his pawns now, the way Magnus is playing it, taking that pawn and coming to take all of white's pawns to draw this, so safely drawing with black, and the rest is just okay. Wow, okay, so interesting game. Ivanchuk shows that he can survive huge time pressure and still play decent moves. He was never worse in this game, it seems, so good stuff. Let's hope he can also do better in other rounds. He's been playing exciting chess, win, lose or draw, and okay, so Magnus only drawing now this round, held to a draw. So let's go on to another game. Peter Zvidler against Boris Gelfand. Zvidler kicked off with d4. Boris played knight f6. After c4, yes, we have another Grunfeld here, very popular Grunfeld. So c takes, knight takes. Now bishop d2, slightly unusual move. Bishop d2, knight b6, e3. So what's the idea here? It's revealed actually. Bishop g7. This bishop seems strange to have on d2 here, but now even stranger, you might think, is this next move, f4. This must be a rare bird system. It looks as though it's like, isn't it full of light square weaknesses here? What's going on here? But black at the moment doesn't have an easy c5 break, it seems. So if e5 is prevented with this bind, that's quite handy. Okay, after castles, knight f3, bishop g4, and white's grabbing the light square bishop, which seems a useful attacking weapon. This light square bishop in balance. So c6, and now, interestingly, and it's justified, I think, by the position. The absence of the defensive knight on f6 means this sort of next move, a hack attack move, might be more justified. h4. Okay. Hack attack. So Boris responds with knight 8d7. He's trying to get a defensive knight potentially to f6. And also maybe this g4 could be a weakness, with both pawns not doing anything about the g4 square. This is an open invitation positionally for black to occupy that g4 square potentially. h5, carrying on seemingly dangerous attack, but with the fianchettoed bishop, you know, even if white gets in a queen h7, the king just often shifts to f8, and this bishop hemmed in behind its pawns, it's going to be maybe difficult to checkmate black with that defensive fianchettoed bishop. So we see e6, hg, hg. It's not dangerous at the moment. It would seem, you know, just rook e8, inviting queen h7, or knight f6, or just simply knight f6. So e4 is played here. Now there is a suggestion that that maybe this was not needed. It slightly loosens white's pawn structure longer term, even if tactically black can't take immediately. He played e4. Even if black tactically can't take immediately, that structure in the centre has been loosened. On the other hand, f5 liberates the bishop to try and get rid of the defensive bishop. So swings and roundabouts with e4. It's worth, I think, checking in the second pass if white had just castled queenside. Now we see a stop being put for white playing f5, f5, and positionally this g4 square is marked out as well for a nice knight to occupy g4. Okay. Obviously we need to check out taking on d4, but in principle it seems quite dangerous to take on d4, giving white extra development for his attack, extra speed for his attack rather. But okay, and now we see another really aggressive move, g4 from white. So his vidder's turned into a madman this round. g4. Boris responds with knight f6. And he's going to be making use of that g4 square. White centre's a bit loose. G takes though, but open lines. Tell Mike like these open lines. E takes. E5, but now this blockage on g5, knight g4. Okay, and d4 is loose here. If white castles maybe queen, or is that far too dangerous? This knight's quite handy to stop any bishop c4 at the moment. But anyway, Peter played d5 here, and after c takes, now castles queenside. Bit of a hairy position. Hairy, scary, interesting position to analyse in the second pass here. So what on earth is going on? Black plays d4. Okay. If only this knight wasn't on b6. White plays now knight b5, which looks as though that's quite promising to go to d6. That would seal the king escape route. And if you play like queen h3 with a knight on d6, that's pretty good fun for a queen h7 mate. Queen d5 though, and now this makes things quite difficult. And look at white's king. Castling on the queen side is often controversial. And okay, so queen h3 is played, ignoring any rook c8 or queen a2. There's queen h7 and knight d6 as menacing threats here. We see check, and now the move rook c6, indicating a willingness perhaps to just sack the exchange on knight d6. e6 cuts off f7 as well. Now that's snapped off, and then we see bishop g2, which gives white potential kicking for the queen along the e file, as well as potentially using this diagonal. So it seems quite scary. But Boris now just calmly plays knight f2, kind of family fork here, but inviting this check. King f7. Okay, is it really scary for the black king, or is it scary for the white king? We see rook de1, queen f6. Thankfully the knight is also handling the d5 square. This knight on b6 has been pretty useful defensively. But he's offering this exchange, and that's taking the exchange sack. B takes c6. Now knight c7. And with knight c7 there seems to be one or two threats. For example, rook e6 is supported here. So black can't be too casual here. He plays rook h8, which seems to encourage white to give up the queen here. There doesn't seem to be too many other moves. So the queen is given up. And in return now, white has this move, knight e8. If the queen goes back, there seems to be a large material loss emerging with taking possibly butter. Maybe there's better moves. So something for the second pass here. But black simply played knight takes h1. Now we see knight takes f6. Now I think both players were in severe time trouble. Knight g3 was played, and this knight looks to be in a little bit of bother. Does it have the e8 square, or is knight e4 quite powerful? Maybe the knight can stumble to c7, okay, or does it have h7 where simply it can use the g5 hook from that f4 pawn? Well, I'm afraid with both players in time trouble, I'm afraid that they went for a draw. They agreed a draw. Now please don't be outraged. Yeah, okay. It's a mystery now. We need to analyse this final position. How the game would have panned out. Let's check possibilities here. So they agreed a draw at move 31 after knight g3. So both players in time trouble. Let's have a look to see what's going on here. It was mega complicated earlier. They had to calculate a lot. It would seem, from the nature of the positions, you have to calculate a lot. So here, knight h7 is preferred over anything else. If knight e8, knight e4 is very, very strong, it seems. Now why? Well, it's attacking the bishop and the knight. It's actually a double attack. So that's one reason. So white's just losing material, losing that bishop. Here, rook takes. This knight's stranded. This e4 knight was taking care of d6, and now knight d5 takes care of c7, leaving the knight stranded. And this looks pretty bad news, actually. Although there's the tactical knight c7. Let's follow this through. Here, not knight takes c7, there's rook h7 chain. But, so even though this is unstranding the knight tactically, knight takes f4. And black's still better here. He's got this dangerous d pawn. This looks technically as though it's winning for black, the exchange down, but for 3 pawns is pretty huge compensation for being exchanged down. So it's not directly because the knight's stranded and lost, it's losing like this. Okay, so let's just undo that variation. Whoops. Gone into a... Oh dear. Pardon me. Okay, got the main game score back. So this knight g3. Okay. So let's say that knight e8 is ruled out. So knight h7 becomes the main move. Knight e4. And it's apparently nice to play knight g5 here to get rid of that strong knight. Well, it is attacking the bishop. Knight takes g5, f takes. Now, Peter is the exchange up here, but it's for 2 pawns. And black does have knight c4, which is aggressive looking. So it's easy, I think, maybe for white to go wrong here. Okay, let's say he played bishop f4. Or is it d3 and b2's a problem? Let's go with rook c1, d2, Bishop takes b2. Bishop takes d2. White's the exchange up, but this g5 now looks weak. But what is going on here? This is just a long example variation. So yes, there's yeah, it's exchange for 2 pawns. It looks as though White's got a slight advantage technically here. Okay, so yeah, that final position is there's quite a lot of play left in it. It seems potentially favouring White slightly, but so knight h7, knight g5 would be the way to go, I think, here. Knight e4 being Black's best move, so knight g5, and we have this kind of position with knight c4. I think the best move again here, just to try and get b2, so that attacks the bishop. We try and if another move instead, king c2, then we can try and get pressure on g5, perhaps. Okay, so it is worthy of analysis, the final position. But let's go back earlier. There were some hair-raising complications in this game. So e3. Has this been played much before, this position? If I do a reference check, I wouldn't expect thousands of games in this position, because I think bishop d2 was quite a surprise. No, we're talking about 11 games in my reference database, and f4 it's not even here. Knight f3, 9 times before. Kengis is one of the players that's played knight f3. There's one game with h3 and one game with a4. So earlier, this bishop d2 is a bit of a shock. Check the reference database here. Bishop d2, very. No, it's not too bad. No, pardon me. 1543 games with bishop d2. It's got Anand Topalov, Kramnik, Morozovich playing it. It's not such a surprise thing. So e4 is the absolute main line, 19,403. But bishop d2, yeah. So where did it actually go off the rails here, this game? Knight b6, 238 games. The main move is bishop g7, 1283. So e3, is this the move which is a bit surprising? Yes. In this position, actually, 116 games with bishop g5, keeping the bishop outside like the pawn chain. Knight f3, 76 games. Bishop here, bishop to f4, 32. e3, only 10 games. So this is the rare bird move, actually, e3 in this game. And this is even rarer. This is a really rare setup, this position. We're really out of reference at move 7, which is quite unusual. So now, okay, I guess both sides are having to improvise. As Peter has prepared this system in particular. But bishop g4, okay, it looks slightly controversial giving up the light square bishop here. So bishop takes f3, but okay. We see h4, knight 8 d7, h5, hack attack, here we come, e6. White does seem to have a promising position. Let's go with castling or hg. Let's look at hg first and castling now. What advantage would this have in not playing e4? The centre is stronger. Let's go with f5. This bishop hemmed in, has it got any prospects of getting a zigzag or something? Let's go with bishop e2 or g4. g4. Take. The king really going to evacuate with king f7? Is that realistic? Yeah, maybe it's a different game. It's a different game altogether with this bishop on d2. But interesting. In fact, bishop. Okay, rook g5 here, and this is an interesting continuation. Just keeping the centre more solid is another way of playing it. So the way Pitt played it seems okay. He's interested in using this bishop and playing for f5. So he plays for e4, but that's blockaded with f5. g4. Okay, seems dangerous. If bishop takes d4, let's actually quickly check this out. Why would this be bad? Queen h3 is actually very dangerous now, threatening mate. And if rook e8, then we can have e5, cutting the bishop away from h8. Okay, so that's starting to be really quite dangerous. Check, check. And now if king f8, this is mating, isn't it, with rook h8, mating 2. So this is all pretty dangerous stuff, which black doesn't want to get involved in. So it's best to avoid taking this pawn, basically. So go for the blockade, go for the g4 square instead. Okay, so we got this nice looking knight g4. Now here, if white had just castled, is actually d4, can it be taken? Or is it still quite dangerous? It's going to give white quality and time. This sort of position looks favourable for white. It looks dangerous for black. So bishop e2 challenging that knight as well. Or maybe it's just a slight plus. Okay, so possibly the pawn is for the taking in any case. So we see actually d5. Maybe a bit concerned about that. So it does open up the c file potentially against white's king, and I mean this could potentially have been really dangerous. So d4, knight b5, queen d5. What is white actually threatening here? The main threat, knight d6. Knight d6 and on stuff to follow. So queen d5, queen h3. Now rook fc8 check was played here. Okay, let's go with that. That looks promising. Knight f2 is not so hot. Check. Check. Black has to play queen takes d6 here. Look at this. Oh, for rook h8, trapping the queen. And still white would be slightly better here. On this brief depth, white slightly better apparently, but it's a chaotic position. Okay, so in the game we see check, and white is threatening knight d6 surely as the main threat. So rook c6. So if we went knight d6 here, I think it just gets snapped off. Well, apparently knight d6 is playable here. Anyway, e6 was played in the game. Maybe knight d6 is okay. Or even rook c1. Rook c1. But knight d6 allowing it to be snapped off. Again, if black takes on d6 now. Bishop g2. What is white actually threatening here? Oh, check with the queen. And then bishop b4. Wow. Some serious threats here in this position. This might be the way for white to go, to have played knight d6. If knight c4, shielding that diagonal, this looks hairy. White might be might be an improvement on the game continuation, but it looks quite scary for both sides. Okay, so in the game we saw White not testing Black's exchange, sacking the exchange. Played actually e6, and it seems actually that changed the evaluation completely to Black being slightly better at this depth, at this minimal depth. I don't know if that's going to change in a little bit. Just taking the pawn. I guess from a human point of view, allowing this exchange check does liberate the bishop, but it seems to be one of the better moves. Another move is simply rook c1, just to take there and then renew the threat of knight d6. And if like ac8, we can take knight d6 here, it's probably safer for the white king than the other variation, with one pair of rooks coming off. Or is it bishop g2 here tactically? Very complicated positions in this game. Very, very complicated. But this use of b3 is interesting, to be able to use b3 for a check. Okay, so let's go back to the game. Rook c6, e6, and it seems technically this gave Black the advantage at this depth anyway. It gave Black an advantage. Taking bishop g2. Knight f2, now check. Rook de1. Queen f6 looks logical. Black's threatening rook h8, now trapping. That's the major thing, to trap White's queen. So White plays taking on c6, and ingeniously knight c7 is the only kind of move, I think. What does he do? If he moves his queen out of the way, well, that's defeatist. Just as an example of what's going on, though. Knight takes. Black's miles better. He can't do anything. It seems this move, knight c7, and this concept of giving up the queen seems to be the only move. There's nothing else. Knight c7. This had to be worked out. Knight c7. If we play bishop b4, okay. White seems to be threatening. Is it rook? What is White actually threatening? Knight d6. Okay. And if we take, check, take this, takes, rook h8 again, and Black's miles better. Miles better, it seems. Okay. So this is virtually, it seems a virtually forced move, not to play knight c7. With this subsequent idea. So rook h8. There's an option here. In the game we saw queen takes h8, which is coming up now. Queen takes h8, but there's an option of rook e6 as well, which seems viable. So rook e6 or queen takes h8. If rook e6, let's have a quick look here. Takes, check, take, check. We're taking, and it looks as though technically this is about equal. So rook e6 wasn't played. Instead, in this position, we saw queen takes h8, more dramatic, and now this knight e8 move. Is this really sound, giving up the queen to play knight e8? let's test it with queen d8 now. So if rook takes h8, knight d5, what is black actually pressing? Let's have a look. Knight e4. Okay. If we go with check, check. Now not here, rook takes g6 apparently is quite promising for white. Let's go here. I think black's now threatening queen takes. Nope. Knight e4, queen b6, okay. Let's go rook b7. Queen h4. Once black gets in knight e4, surely black's going to be okay. Check. Murky positions. Okay, so it's murky positions. Let's go back. So knight e8, we see actually knight takes h1, and the advantage is really swinging backwards and forwards here. Now white's slightly better again. So knight takes f6, knight g3, and this was the final move of the game. Well, we saw tons of variations with the help of engines, but to calculate any number of variations takes a lot of time and energy over the board, and is not as accurate as engines. So maybe they were both shattered by the content of this game up to this point at move 31. Okay, bit of an anticlimax draw, I guess, from all that. Okay, I'm going to have a coffee break now because I feel wrecked. So before carrying on, so see you in a bit. Okay, I had a bit of a break and feeling a little bit more refreshed. So let's now look at Grishchuk versus Radjabov. This kicked off with d4, and Radjabov played not a King's Indian defense, but something much more classical. So c4, e6, we see knight f3, d5, classically occupying the center, accepting potentially bad bishop, which needs to be handled later. Okay, so knight c3, bishop e7, bishop f4, very solid continuation from Grishchuk. Black castled, e3. This is a very grippy opening. White has got a very strong grip on the position, particularly the e5 square. He might want to be concerned about this bishop on f4 later for knight h5, so we'll see. Knight bd7 is played, and in this position now we see c5 actually. Now sometimes c5 can be controversial if black can play the energetic b6, and if b4 a5, sometimes this can work out quite well for black. For the moment, black is actually interested now in this bishop. Another move for white theoretically was actually to play h3 to give the bishop a parking spot, but here, okay, this is a subject of attack now. Knight h5. Is it important, this dark square bishop in this particular pawn structure though? A lot of white's pawns after c5 are on dark squares. White's interested in a dark square grip. So with the light square bishop, that's more harmonious with these pawns on dark squares in any case. So white actually just plays bishop e2 here. And the double pawns give white a tighter grip on e5 and potential pressure along the e file later. It is taken, so we have this dynamic pawn structure. And now black plays b4, and after b6, after b4 now a5. White supports this with a3. So this bishop for the moment seems hemmed in. Black's got in a kind of bind, not a Maroczy bind, which is usually c4 and a4, but a kind of Pillsbury bind with d4 and f4 pawns. So is this going to be useful? Can black's bishop pair offset this bind? We see the move c6 here. Now to castles, queen c7. attacking the f4 pawn that's protected with g3. Now we see g6. It might be useful for white in certain circumstances to have played f5 to undermine potentially the d5 pawn for b5s later. So this is kind of a safety move, and black is doing well on the dark square, so weakening the dark squares here is of little consequence. White hasn't got the dark square bishop. The queen's not going to come to h6 in a hurry with this pawn on f4, so this kind of weakening here just to prohibit f5 is seemingly quite useful. So rook e1, and now black is interested in actually exchanging off the light square bishops, and in doing so, okay, both players have potential light square issues, but white's are more pronounced at the moment, particularly c4. If black ever exchanged off and got a knight to c4, that could be annoying. We see queen c2, no attempt to stem this off with b5. I think takes, and we've got a pin in any case on this knight. So we see queen c2 and the bishops come off, knight takes. Now rook a7, black's using that a file. Rook ab1, taking on b4 and doubling. So black's got that a file, but it's not of great consequence here. If it hasn't got targets to come down to the 7th rank, it might not be that useful. And in fact, even the a2 square is taken away with knight c1. We see rook a3 attacking the knight here. Knight d3, bishop f6 now. Okay, king g2, safeguarding f3 even more. Queen b7, rook ec1. So white's just strengthening the position and potentially threatening taking for this. But this pressure is useful for tying down the white queen. King g7, queen d1. Okay, and now with the knight protected, actually taking a knight c5 might be of interest. Black stops that option with b5. Knight de5, the rook on 8, the 8th row comes to a4, rook c2, bishop d8. So white has got this iron grip on the position, and it's difficult for black to really do anything here. So let's see what happens. Are they going to agree a draw quickly or something? So h6, knight d3, knight f6, knight fe5, knight d7, a bit of shuffling. Now knight takes e5, a little bit of a change in the position. And you'd think that white might be interested in taking with the f pawn to undouble. Actually, white takes with the d pawn. So that's quite interesting. So what advantage does that give over taking with the f pawn? Okay, maybe that's something for checking in the second pass in detail. Queen d7. I'll make actually a note of that. Taking with f pawn. Okay, so queen d7, and there seems to be some potential for playing d4 and queen d5 right now. It's ignored, that potential is ignored. So rook b3, bishop e7, knight e1. This pawn might just be weak on d4, that's the problem. Now knight e1 looks as though the knight's interested in coming potentially to d4. Knight c2 attacking the rook, going to d4 as potentially as well, like that. An exchange of rooks. Okay, now white's one move away from knight d4, which might be risky because of rook a2, but then rook b2, but it is actually attacking c6. On bishop takes c5, again knight c6 might be interesting. But anyway, in this position, an interesting move is played by Rajabov. Okay, and he has obviously the option of pinning the knight anyway here as well. So what would happen there if the knight was pinned? Maybe potentially something like queen d3 for rook. That's getting too risky with this pin actually. But I think we need to check out rook a2. But the interesting move he played here is actually bishop takes c5. He gives up the whole bishop for just 2 pawns initially. So he takes. So what's this all about? Knight e3. So black has these potential passed pawns over here. White's pawn majority is not so pronounced with a double pawn. So these are like 2 connected passed pawns against nothing, no resistance potentially. But is this knight going to be dangerous? h5 stops the use of g4 for a moment. Queen c2 offering the exchange of queens, that's rejected. Rook b2, now rook e4. So black's got an interesting kind of idea here, just to potentially roll his pawns forward. Rook b1. He's got to be careful. If d4 knight c4, we've got a pin here, and then we can go to d6. So c5, and we see knight d1. It's an impressive looking armada of pawns coming up. Queen c6, knight c3. That's pinned. So there's no rook b5, queen b5. That's pinned to the queen d3, b4, knight e2, queen a4. It looks as though black's making some progress here with his pawns. They look a little bit more menacing. And white now plays a counter dynamic move, plays f5, trying to break up black's chain. If takes, then take on d5. And if takes here, well, then there's options like queen e3 or knight f4. We see actually black playing queen c2, and now the queen's coming off, and now knight f4 here. Still eyeing either this pawn or this pawn. If this takes, we take this. If this takes, we take that. G takes, we see check here, and now knight f6. So are black's pawns quite significant? It looks still quite impressive. Rook a2, stopping the rook coming back from maybe a mating net possibilities, if the rook ever came like that in conjunction with these pawns. Knight d7 hitting c5 immediately. Rook a5. And now it's white's turn to counter sack. Otherwise these pawns are getting pretty dangerous. White plays knight takes c5, getting rid of the 2 connected passed pawns for the knight. And we reach a peaceful rook and pawn ending now. Black actually plays d4, offering to swap the d pawn for the e pawn. And here they agreed a draw. Okay, it was quite a fighting draw, 51 moves. Let's check that out. Go to some critical positions, some technical positions, really. Theoretically, for those interested, the move c5, allowing the double pawns, is actually the top move here. One of the top moves. 260 games of that. Ponomarov, Vanwelli, they played that before. Queen c2, 158 games. a3, 147. C takes 135, bishop d3 89, rook ac1 84, h3 67. There's a lot of options here being played by a lot of good players. Coulson has played c takes d5 before, Kasparov has played a3 before, Radjabov has played queen c2 before. Okay. So Radjabov as white has played queen c2, and Svidler queen c2 here. Okay, there's a lot of options, so this is an interesting dynamic option. Accepting the double pawns, at least we have a non-symmetrical pawn structure, which is one sign of an interesting game. But okay, was white actually threatening f5? Actually, if white was given another move here, the move f5 doesn't actually do anything quite here. So it's just the safety check on f5 in the future, maybe. So here, queen c2, and it's kind of a locked-in, grippy kind of position. It's not really too much going on at the moment. Was white actually threatening anything with queen d1? Apparently potentially b5 here for c6. If it takes, then c6. and if it takes like this, d takes c5. So that was addressed. Actually, the threat seems to be b5 here. That's the major principal threat apparently. So b5 stops white from playing b5. Okay. Let me see here, bishop d8, queen e2. Looks like some standard sort of maneuvering, but now a change with knight takes e5. So here is a question. The engine is actually giving f takes as reasonable, as well as knight takes. Actually, I think the engine is surprised with d takes. A little bit surprised, or no, it's just about the same. It's just about the same. So f takes, would that have offered anything different really? I'm not sure there's anything to write home about. Black's got that A file, which, although there's no targets, black seems to be fairly safe here. The dark squares are covered by the bishop. The knight can't do too much damage, it seems. It looks fairly stable. So we see d takes e5 instead of f takes, keeping these double pawns. Okay, and now knight d1. Okay, we see an exchange of rooks. And this bishop takes c5 move. Is white actually threatening knight d4? No. I think white wants to play rook b2 first, or anything else apart from knight d4. In fact, I think knight d4 is just asking for a bit of trouble, maybe with rook a2. So we see, in any case, black plays bishop takes c5, which is an interesting move, getting two connected pass pawns for the knight, kind of exploiting white, the fact that white's got double pawns, that these two can potentially roll down here. White with knight e3 must be threatening surely knight g4. Yeah, knight g4, just to go to f6, and then after that maybe there's some dangers being faced later on. Okay, so h5 extinguishes that, and then we see queen c2. Queens came off. No, the queens didn't come off, pardon me. Queen b6. If the queens come off, then does white have anything? Say rook c4, knight e3. Maybe it's not such a big deal, this extra piece in this particular position. So let's go back. Queen b6 instead. Rook b2. We see rook e4. Rook b1. c5. Knight d1. Queen c6. Lining up against the king as well. Knight c3. Rook c4. Queen d3. b4. Starting to drive white back a bit. Queen a4. It looks about equal here now from the engine point of view. f5. We see now queen c2, which is a reasonable move. Takes. Now knight f4. I think this is the knight has to move anyway. It's been attacked, so that's the idea, to keep an option whatever way that pawn's taken. Okay, so it's like this. Knight f6, rook a2. Okay, king. We see knight d7 after rook a5, just neutralizing the imbalances of the position with now knight takes c5. If it wasn't taken, well, I guess let's have a look quickly. King f3, d4. Well, knight b6 actually would exploit the c4 square potentially. I'm not sure d4. It looks quite kind of committal. If black doesn't do anything, maybe that's like safer here. Just king g6. Or even, I mean, what's wrong with rook b5? Would that be terrible? Just to threaten c4 or b3. White wants to get rid of those two connected pass pawns potentially, so he does so immediately before they can get any more inertia. And we got a peaceful position. Okay, so a fighting draw there. So let's have a look at the other game of the round. Now, Vladimir Kramnik against Levon Aronian. Okay, we see knight f3 from Vladimir, not such a hotly debated theoretical position to start off with. G3, a reversed King's Engine called the King's Engine attack instead of the King's Engine defense. So bishop g4, bishop g2, e6, c4. The formation for white, independent of what black's doing, is like King's Engine attack formation where it was. Now c4, so c6. After castles, knight f6. Now Vladimir just takes on d5, and black voluntarily gives up the light square bishop, which might seem a little bit controversial, but often giving up this light square bishop is part of a dark square strategy to put pressure on dark squares later. Okay, now d4, bishop e7, e3, black castles, bishop d2. Now a curious move, queen b8, but it's respecting the mobility of the pawns. This pawn can be aggressively used like this now, with the queen not blocking in, say on b6. So, and it looks also potentially, you know, black. Well, it's not in a position for any e5 actually at the moment. So I think the principal idea is just queenside counterplay. So rook c1, rook c8, bishop d2, and now the queenside counterplay, b5. Now white reacts energetically here with e4. He has got the light square bishop. Why not break it open on the diagonal? And it loosens white's centre a bit, but he's also now tactically got bishop f4 available. So we see actually after b4, not knight a4, but bishop f4, asking the queen where it wants to go, and now getting a tempo after queen b6, getting a tempo knight a4. Has white really achieved anything? This bishop's still locked in. Okay, and now this is quite interesting, I think, because actually the intention wasn't necessarily, the contingency plan wasn't necessarily breaking open the bishop on this diagonal. It looks a little bit like a French defense structure after e5, and in the French defense, white's phonetic plan is often f4, f5. So this position, if you imagine French defense positions with the bad bishop on c8, everyone calls that bishop bad, but often it's inhibiting f5 from white. White's actually got the extra light square bishop. So this f4, f5, in theory, if it's anything like a French defense, it looks exactly like French defense structure in some ways. In theory, f4, f5 is going to have more punch to it, especially with d5 just being held up by the queen. So bishop e3 gets out of the way of f4, f5. The undermining the pawn chain can begin. So white has kingside counterplay here. Knight b6 against the queenside play of Levon. Now, interestingly, you know, knight c5 you might consider, unless there's something tactically wrong with it, and it looks as though knight takes d4 just intuitively might undermine that c5 knight. So that might not actually be a valid option here because of knight takes d4. That's something. Actually, queen takes d4. No, I think this is something we should check in the second pass anyway. If queen takes d4 might hold that. But after knight c5, it wasn't chosen for some reason. So we need to work out why. Possibly knight takes e5 is another way of undermining, trying to undermine the c5 knight. Potentially black's got these three pieces to attack c5. So you might expect some sort of tactic. Knight d4, queen d4, but knight e5 more promising. Okay, so in the game we see actually Vladimir playing knight takes b6. So he's positively inviting a file pressure, which you can't do anything really about. I mean, he can rather protect the pawn at least if he wants to, but this is where the game really gets interesting. He doesn't bother protecting the pawn. He plays f4. Okay. Does Levon really want to take this a2 pawn? Well, he does. He tests white. Now we see f5. It looks dangerous, and also not just if black takes. If black doesn't, f6 looks potentially dangerous as well. So the lesser evil move potentially is e takes f5 anyway, even if it loosens d5 here, making this bishop, you know, feel its presence. So 2 pawns up now after e takes f5. Okay, and now the queen is the only thing protecting d5, and that's shut off with b3. So the queen comes back to a5 to protect d5. Queen f3, double attacking d5 and f5. Knight d8. Okay, an interesting position. Queen takes d5. So only a pawn down, and these pawns are just doubled, so it's not really an amazing extra pawn for black. And white's bishop pair is more liberated. On the other hand, this could be a good square for the knight. We see an exchange of rooks. Queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook at a5. Bishop comes back to f3. So what's happened here? Well, white still has this weakness now. Black still can use the a file, and he does. Rook a3. Rook c8, though, looks like a nasty pin. What's going on here? Isn't this really threatening to play d5 and d6 to undermine the pin protection? Levon takes, surprisingly. He's not scared of d5. Of course he's not. The bishop's hanging here in any case. King f2. So now d5, d6 though is renewed as a threat. Black plays now rook c3, rook b8, and now he's got this b pawn as counterplay. b3. Okay. So white has to be very careful here. He takes on b6. Okay. Let's see. If he had played d5, that must surely lead to big trouble. That's something to check in the second pass. So he took on b6, holding up that b pawn for sure. And now we see g5, giving the king a square, and potentially f4 is useful. Rook b8. Rook c4. Okay, and now d5, and now rook b4. So this b pawn is again dangerous. Exchange of rooks. The pawn must be stopped. So now b2, we've got bishop c2, which happens. Knight b7. So after all that, what's going on here? Why isn't the g pawn hanging? That is taken. Knight c5. Okay, so now it looks quite dangerous for knight e4 check and knight c3. Bishop takes f5, gets rid of knight e4 check. Knight a4, still for knight c3 potentially. d6, knight c3, d7. Both sides' advanced pawns are balancing each other here. King e3. Now f6. Okay. f6. This is taken with the bishop, keeping potential two connected passed pawns. But it does go into knight d5 check, which breaks up the pawns anyway. Knight takes, e takes. King f7, and we look to be heading for an opposite coloured bishop and pawn ending, where white is 2 pawns up now. King takes f6, king d5, king e7, king c6, blockade, bishop e1. Black can set up a dark square blockade though, which he does. and it's difficult for Vladimir to make progress now in this particular position. This dark square blockade is pretty useful to stop white's extra material, and he gives up the B pawn now to get the D pawn, and we have a situation where, okay, there's another dark square blockade about to arise. Here, king f4, and white now cannot make progress. Dark square blockade achieved here. Draw. So a 72 move draw there. There were some interesting moments. Let's go back and check the interesting moments in particular. So, out of the opening, white had a slight plus, it seems. Black's going for queenside play, and Vladimir plays this e4 plan, which is not just about the bishop, it's about this f4, f5 potentially. So Black's got some queenside play. So the first technical question, knight c5, I believe it's knight takes e5 would be good. Nope. I don't think knight takes e5 even does anything. Okay, knight b3. Oh, knight b3, just knight b3. That's better for white. Here, actually, bishop takes c5, apparently. Now, if rook takes c5, we just take on a2. Okay, and that's better for black, apparently. And if d takes c5, then we do just, I assume, nope, not taking on e5. Sorry, this knight's attack, knight c4, and this is promising for black. If the exchange attack is not made here, let's see. We have just queen takes a2, terrible for white. And if an exchange attack is played, this is a murky position. What's going on here? Exchange down, but the bishops look quite good. I'm not sure it's enough. Black's still better. Okay, potentially. So, knight b6, we saw actually the move knight takes b6, which the engine likes. Now getting on with this undermining plan, f4. And the engine's actually liking g6 here to try and prevent f5, but Levon invites it. So f5, and now taking, and now b3. It looks as though white had a certain pressure here. I think the commentators, the official commentators were optimistic about Vladimir's chances around here for winning the game. Now what about queen takes f5? Instead of queen takes d5, queen takes f5. Does it do anything? What is white actually threatening? Well, okay, after the rook's been dealt with, what is white actually threatening? Queen d7 is an immediate threat here. Queen d7. Okay. So say black tries to parry queen b5, queen d7. Okay, bishop f1. Queen can go back. Rook c8. This looks quite dangerous, really, for black. But has white got any concrete opportunity here? I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that white has anything too devastating. So he took on d5 instead. There's also the option of taking on c8 for taking on f5 with tempo. That's interesting to have a quick look at. So taking on f5 now, attacking the rook. So d7, that infiltration point needs to be sealed up. So rook c7. Now we've got something. There might be something in the position here. I think this is why commentators were excited. So e6. What is going on with e6? You might wonder. Well, immediately, the obvious thing is this is horrible, that's a mate in 4-3. But if f takes, there's a subtle resource here, white has. Queen h5, threatening again queen e8. And now it's pretty dangerous. White potentially has got some cunning resources. If black tries to stop queen e8, white has bishop e4 here, using that pin on h7. And this could be curtains for black. So say h6, just smash black up here. It's end of game. Black's getting mated. It's horrible. So this is some of the underlying danger of queen takes f5. So e6 here takes queen h5. How does black actually defend this? If h6, bishop takes h6 again, looks pretty good. Hack attack time. It looks as though black's had it really. In this position, actually bishop g5. What is the threat? What is the threat here? Just obviously the knight's okay. The knight's got to move. If knight f7, queen takes e6. This looks pretty strong. Whatever's going on here. Let's imagine rook d7 for example. Bishop takes. Queen takes e6. Now here rook takes f8. So yeah, this looks like a really vicious attack, just with the move in this position. Rook takes c8. So in this position, which Vladimir had, he can force things along. With rook takes c8 here, is this a missed opportunity for Vladimir Kramnik against Levon Aronian? There's some very good tactical resources here, which Tal will be proud of, including e6 coming up here. Queen d7 is a principal threat. So, you know, imagine, for example, rook b8. Queen d7 to get into that e8 square is actually uncomfortable. You might think, well, why? Let's have a, well, we can't lose the bishop. If we move the bishop, in this position, why is bishop g5 so crushing? Well, d5 is also loose with queen d7. This queen d7, pardon me, this queen d7. d5 is now threatened as well. So where is the knight going? And it's trying to hold up f7 as well. So black's overloaded. Black doesn't seem to have much of a defense here. If knight e6, we just surely take on f7. And then we can even play, well, we just take the knight. So yeah, this looks as though this is a winning shot at the moment. Just rook takes c8 in this position. Is it possible that this was underestimated by Vladimir, that this position? Because white does have e6. I'm not sure what else black can consider here. Let's say rook a8. Does that make any difference for e6? We don't need to play e6, so we can play queen d7. King f8. Okay, this is slightly different. The king comes to rescue the e8 square. This is slightly more tricky. Maybe white can just take on d5 here. So let's go with this and just taking on d5 and using the centre pawns. This looks potentially like a better version of the game. Yeah, maybe that's not as convincing as what we've seen earlier anyway. So it was a dangerous opportunity, it seemed, in this position to play rook takes and queen takes f5. So instead we see queen takes d5 and simplification here. Okay. Actually, why if there's interest in protecting this pawn, I guess b5 is a resource. Or knight e6 might be possible here, or king f8 just to get out of this pin. And then here, I don't know if white actually has. Okay, if d5, we play bishop c5, and that should be okay for black. So okay, the bishop moved back, and then we saw rook a3. This pin, threatening d5 now. So black's quick to react, attacking the bishop. That's protected. Quick again, attacking the rook. Yeah, now b3. Now here, white hasn't got a chance to do much else. This pawn is a menace, surely. Can white afford to play d5 in this position? b2 takes. Oh, rook takes e3. This is what this is about. Rook takes e3, and black's winning. It seems black's much better because of this bishop c5 check. So that's pretty nasty. The pawn has to be arrested, as Nimzowitsch would say. It's a criminal. You know, needs to be kept under lock and key. The passed pawn. So rook takes b6 is satisfying the Nimzowitschian ideal. The criminal needs to be kept under lock and key. So, for tactical reasons in this position, very tactical reasons, and we see g5, a bit radical really. Is there any other move which would be good? Maybe check as well, and b2. Now d5 here, isn't this really scary though? h6, d6, bishop g5. Maybe this isn't so scary. Okay, because this b pawn ties down the rook, so maybe it's not too bad. Alright, so in the game we saw the radical g5, radical looking. Rook b8. What else is there? Okay, bishop d1 as well is interesting. But okay, going on the game path here. Now again, this b pawn needs to be stopped. So bishop d1, b2, bishop c2, and okay, knight b7, bishop takes g5. For the moment, this b pawn is still a menace. Now black is now threatening knight e4 check, which would be a crushing. Well, winning the bishop anyway, so that's taken away. d6, knight c3, and we reach soon. Okay, the b pawn is going to guarantee knocking out white's bishop pair. f6, is this a very, very good move in the circumstance in this position? f6. What is going on with f6, in fact? So in the game we saw bishop takes. If e takes, maybe black can just queen. And the pawns are broken up, so maybe this is the point. That king f7. Well, black has the extra piece though. That should be enough, surely. So black should be okay, I think. So we see bishop takes f6. Now black gets rid of that dark square bishop, leaving opposite colour bishops. So e takes f6 is the other critical point here. Really testing f6 like this. What can black do here? So if he queens, we can take, and white doesn't have to try and get back his piece. If he wanted to, he could play this, getting back his piece with, assume another drawn position. This is going to be difficult to win, surely. Alright, it's an interesting alternative. E takes f6 to investigate as well. But bishop takes f6 was played, and we see the removal of the dark square bishop, leaving opposite colour bishops. And now Levon is able to get a grip on the dark squares, unassailable grip on the dark squares eventually. these pawns in this position with the opposite colour bishops, it's possible with careful, accurate play to get a draw. Okay, yeah, all the rounds, every game in the round, this round was draws, but it was fighting draws. Very interesting game content if you look at it in the variations. Very exciting underneath the surface. Okay, and it leaves. I think it still leaves Aronian and Carlsen in the lead at the moment. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.